August 1945. The Pacific Ocean. A massive shape rises from the black water like a sea monster from nightmare. American sailors aboard the destroyer USS Blue rub their eyes in disbelief. The thing breaching the surface is longer than their warship, heavier than their warship, and it is a submarine. Suddenly, the deck splits open. A hatch the size of a vault door swings wide. From inside, 3 warplanes emerge folded like origami monsters, ready to be catapulted into the sky toward American cities. The captain screams orders. Gunners spin their turrets, but it is too late. They have just discovered Japan's most terrifying secret weapon of the entire war. A submarine designed to bomb New York City, to destroy the Panama Canal, to bring America to its knees in a single morning of fire. This is the story of the I-400, the largest submarine ever built before the atomic age. A vessel so massive, so impossible, so utterly insane, that even the United States Navy refused to believe it existed until they touched its steel hull with their own hands. And behind this monster was not a famous admiral, not a celebrated engineer. It was a quiet shipyard welder named Kenji Tanaka, a man whose name appears in no history book, who spent 18 months hunched over a curved figure-8 pressure hull, sealing the seams that would carry death across half the world. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next episode. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Become part of our community of history hunters today. By the time you finish watching this video, you will understand how 3 submarines, 14 aircraft, and 1 desperate plan came within 30 days of changing the entire outcome of World War II. You will see how a forgotten welder helped build the most ambitious naval weapon in human history. And you will learn why the United States Navy scuttled these monsters in the deepest waters they could find, terrified that the world might one day discover what Japan had nearly accomplished. But to understand the I-400, we must first travel back to a moment of absolute Japanese despair. The year is 1942. The smoke from Pearl Harbor has barely cleared. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands on the bridge of his flagship Yamato, staring at maps of the Pacific Ocean. His face is grim, because Yamamoto knows something his fellow officers refuse to accept. Japan is going to lose this war. Not next month, not next year, but eventually, inevitably, catastrophically. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had seen American factories with his own eyes. He had watched assembly lines spit out automobiles by the thousands. And he understood a truth that haunted him every night. America did not need to win battles. America only needed time. Time to build ships. Time to train pilots. Time to mass-produce destruction on a scale Japan could never match. The numbers were terrifying. In 1942 alone, American shipyards launched 8 aircraft carriers. Japan launched 2. American factories produced 47,836 aircraft that year. Japan managed only 8,861. By 1943, the gap had become a chasm. American industry was producing 1 new warship every single day. Japan was losing ships faster than it could replace them. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had cost Japan 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers in a single afternoon, 3,000 sailors, 250 aircraft, gone in 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks. Japan needed a miracle. Japan needed something the Americans had never seen. Something the Americans could not defend against. Something that would force Washington to the negotiating table before American industry crushed the empire of the sun beneath its weight. Conventional submarines were not the answer. Yes, Japan had submarines. Lots of them. The Type B-1 boats. The KD-6 class. Modified Type A-1 cruiser submarines that could carry a single small float plane each. But these vessels were essentially scouts. They sank merchant ships. They harassed supply lines. They could not strike at the heart of America. And the heart of America was 4,000 miles away from the closest Japanese base. Conventional bombers could not reach it. Aircraft carriers could not approach it without being annihilated by American air patrols. The American homeland was untouchable, or so everyone believed. But everything was about to change because of a man almost no one would ever notice. Hoshino. His name was Kenji Tanaka, 34 years old, a master welder at the Kure Naval Arsenal on the inland sea of Japan. Tanaka had grown up in a fishing village outside Hiroshima. His father had been a boat builder teaching young Kenji how wood and iron could be coaxed into shapes that floated. By the age of 16, Kenji could weld a seam underwater in the dead of winter. By 25, he was supervising hull construction on cruisers and destroyers. He was quiet. He was meticulous. He measured twice. He cut once. He never raised his voice. He never drank with the other men. He went home each night to a small house where his wife Hiroko waited with rice and pickled vegetables, and where his 2 children Yuki and Takeshi slept on tatami mats beneath paper lanterns. Tanaka was not a soldier. He was not a strategist. He was not a designer. He was a craftsman. And in the spring of 1942, he was summoned to a meeting room he had never been allowed to enter. The walls were covered in canvas. Naval officers stood guard at the door. On the table lay a blueprint. Tanaka stared at it. He blinked. He stared again. He thought perhaps that there had been some kind of error in the drafting. Because the submarine on the blueprint was 400 feet long, almost twice the size of any submarine Japan had ever built. The pressure hull was not circular. It was shaped like a figure 8. 2 cylinders, welded together side by side, running the entire length of the vessel. And on top, sitting like a parasitic creature attached to the hull, was a watertight hangar. A hangar long enough to hold 3 warplanes. A senior officer, Captain Ariazumi, leaned across the table. He looked into Tanaka's eyes. He said, "We are going to bomb New York City, and you are going to help us build the weapon that does it." And the idea had been considered insane, ridiculous, suicidal. When Yamamoto first proposed the concept of the underwater aircraft carrier, his own staff had laughed in private. Submarines were small. Aircraft carriers were enormous. Combining them was like trying to crossbreed a shark with an eagle. The engineering challenges were staggering. How do you make a hangar watertight at depths of 300 feet? How do you launch aircraft from a vessel that pitches in heavy seas? How do you store enough fuel for a 6-month voyage halfway around the world? How do you keep the crew sane in a steel coffin the size of a small office building? The answers when they came were beautiful and terrifying. The hangar would be sealed by a vault door 3.5 feet thick, gasketed with 2-inch rubber compressed by hydraulic rams that exerted 30 tons of force. The figure 8 pressure hull would distribute the enormous weight of the hangar above. The aircraft 3 Aichi M6A Siran floatplanes would be specially designed to fold their wings, tails, and pontoons in under 4 minutes. Each plane could carry an 1,870-pound bomb. Each plane was powered by a license-built version of the same Daimler-Benz engine used in the German Messerschmitt 109. The submarine would carry enough fuel to circumnavigate the globe 1.5 times without refueling. It could remain at sea for 4 months. It could surface launch its planes in 45 minutes and dive again before American radar could vector interceptors to its position. The plan was called Operation PX. The first targets were New York City and Washington, D.C., but the bombs would not be conventional explosives. Imperial Japanese Army biological warfare units, including the infamous Unit 731, had developed plague-infected fleas, anthrax spores, and cholera cultures. The intent was to release these agents over American cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and triggering panic that would force America to sue for peace. When senior naval officials learned of this plan, even hardened veterans of the Nanking Massacre were reportedly horrified. The plan was eventually shelved, replaced with a strike on the Panama Canal, but the I-400 was already being built. The monsters were rising in the secret dry docks of Kure. And Kenji Tanaka was welding their bones together. For 18 months, Tanaka barely saw his family. He worked 16-hour shifts, sometimes 20. His hands blistered. His back ached. He coughed black phlegm from inhaling welding fumes inside the cramped figure-8 hull. The workers were forbidden from speaking about what they were building. They were watched constantly by Kempeitai military police. One man, a riveter named Sato, made a joke about the size of the submarine within earshot of an officer. Sato disappeared the next day. No one asked where he had gone. No one wanted to know. Bombed. But Tanaka did his work. He sealed the hangar gaskets. He welded the catapult tracks. He tested every seam with chalk and pressure water until the hull held tight as a drum. He understood in some quiet corner of his mind that what he was building was a weapon of mass annihilation. He understood that Japanese pilots would launch from this vessel and rain death on people who had never harmed his family. He understood that the war was destroying everything he loved, but he also understood that if he refused, he would die, and his wife would die, and his children would die. So he welded, and he prayed, and he waited. The first I-400 was launched on January 18, 1944. The second I-401 followed in March. A third boat, I-402, was eventually converted to a tanker submarine. The original plan called for 18 of these monsters. After Yamamoto's death over Bougainville in April 1943, when American P-38 fighters ambushed his transport plane, the program was cut to 9, then to 5, then to 3. Japan was running out of steel. Japan was running out of fuel. Japan was running out of time. But the Sentoku class, as the I-400 type was officially designated, was finally ready. Sea trials began in early 1945. Captain Ariazumi himself took command of the squadron. The Siran pilots trained relentlessly, practicing the brutal 45-minute deck launch sequence over and over until they could do it in their sleep. Heat the engines with circulating warm oil while still in the hangar. Open the vault door. Wheel the aircraft onto the catapult. Unfold the wings. Lock the floats. Catapult the plane into the air at 90 miles per hour. Repeat. 3 planes per submarine. 6 minutes between launches. Then dive, then disappear. The new target was Ulithi Atoll, the massive American naval anchorage in the Caroline Islands. Hundreds of American warships, including aircraft carriers, were moored there in seemingly endless rows. If the Siran pilots could strike with kamikaze precision, they might destroy a dozen carriers in a single morning. The Siran pilots were ordered to paint their aircraft with American star insignia, an act considered a war crime under the Hague Conventions, to confuse American defenders for the precious seconds needed to drop their bombs. The mission was codenamed Operation Hikari, meaning light. It was scheduled for August 17, 1945. On July 23, 1945, the I-400 and I-401 slipped out of their secret base at Maizuru. The hangars were packed with Saran aircraft, fueled and bombed. The crews ate ceremonial meals of red beans and rice, the traditional Japanese farewell to the dead. Captain Ariazumi gave a speech to the assembled men. He told them they were the last samurai. He told them the fate of the empire rested on their shoulders. He told them they would either return as heroes or they would not return at all. 2,000 miles to the east, an American destroyer named USS Blue patrolled empty ocean. Its crew bored its captain unaware that the largest submarines in human history were steaming toward a target that would bleed the United States Navy white. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. On August 6th, a single B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 40 miles from where Kenji Tanaka had welded the I-400 into existence, his wife Hiroko and his 2 children vanished in a flash brighter than 1,000 suns. On August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio for the first time in history, announcing Japan's unconditional surrender. But the I-400 squadron was at sea, hundreds of feet beneath the Pacific, out of contact, out of reach, still steaming toward Ulithi, still preparing to launch 14 aircraft on a mission that could murder thousands of American sailors and reignite a war that had already ended. And for the next 12 days, confusion reigned aboard the largest submarines ever built. Conflicting orders flooded the radio sets. The Emperor commanded surrender. Naval headquarters demanded the attack continue. Captain Ariazumi paced the bridge torn between samurai honor and imperial duty. The Siran pilots wept openly in the hangar, unable to accept that everything they had trained for was meaningless. And then finally the order came that broke them all. Destroy the aircraft, dump the torpedoes, burn the codebooks, surface and surrender to the nearest American warship. On August 28th, USS Segundo, a Balao-class submarine, encountered a shape on its radar that defied physics. The American crew assumed it was a malfunction. They assumed it was a destroyer. They assumed it was anything except what it actually was. When the I-401 surfaced and the stars and stripes were finally raised over its conning tower, American sailors stood on their deck in stunned silence. The thing in front of them was a submarine that was longer than their submarine, taller than their submarine, and 4 times heavier. It carried weapons they had never imagined. It had been 30 days away from launching an attack that could have killed more American sailors than Pearl Harbor. And aboard the I-400, in a small storage compartment near the engine room, an American boarding party would find something they could not explain. A folded letter written in careful Japanese script addressed to a woman named Hiroko Tanaka. The letter would never be delivered because Hiroko Tanaka no longer existed. She had been vaporized in Hiroshima 2 weeks earlier, along with everyone Kenji Tanaka had ever loved. But the story of the I-400 was not over. Because the United States Navy was about to face a decision that would shape the entire Cold War. A decision involving Soviet spies, a desperate scuttling order, and a secret that would lie buried beneath 2,000 feet of Pacific seawater for the next 68 years. A decision that would determine whether the technology Kenji Tanaka had helped create would fall into the hands of Joseph Stalin, and whether the next World War would begin not with bombers, but with underwater aircraft carriers prowling the coasts of America. In Part 2, we will follow the captured I-400 across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor. We will meet the American intelligence officers who interrogated Captain Ariazumi before he committed suicide in his cabin. We will witness the moment when the Soviet Union demanded access to the submarines, and the moment when the United States Navy made the most controversial decision of the entire post-war period. We will dive with the modern-day explorers who finally discovered the wrecks in 2013, and we will hear for the first time the testimony of Kenji Tanaka himself, the welder who survived because he was at sea testing a different submarine on the morning the bomb fell, and who would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what he had built and why. But the question that haunts us as Part 1 ends is this: if Operation Hikari had launched even 1 week earlier? If the Siran pilots had reached Ulithi? If those 14 biological weapon-capable aircraft had struck a defenseless American anchorage? Would Hiroshima have been the only city to burn? Or would the Pacific War have ended in a horror so vast that history itself would have refused to record it? The answer, as you will see in Part 2, is far more disturbing than anyone in 1945 was willing to admit. In Part 1, we met Kenji Tanaka, the silent welder of Kure, who helped build the largest submarines in human history. We watched the I-400 squadron steam toward Ulithi Atoll, with biological weapon-capable aircraft hidden in their watertight hangars. We saw the war end 30 days before 14 Siran bombers could launch the most devastating surprise attack since Pearl Harbor. We left Captain Ariazumi pacing his bridge torn between samurai honor and imperial surrender. But the story of the I-400 was about to enter a phase darker than anything that came before. Because the moment those monsters surfaced and lowered their flags, a new war began. A war fought in interrogation rooms and embassy corridors. A war fought between former allies who would soon become mortal enemies. A war over the most dangerous technology on Earth. And this is where things turned terrifying. The man who would become the greatest obstacle to American intelligence was not Japanese. He was American. His name was Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of submarine forces in the Pacific Fleet. Lockwood was 65 years old, a career submariner who had spent 4 decades in the silent service. He believed he understood every submarine ever built. He had personally directed the underwater campaign that strangled Japanese shipping. He had earned the Distinguished Service Medal 3 times. And when reports reached Pearl Harbor describing a Japanese submarine 400 feet long, with an aircraft hangar on its deck, Lockwood reportedly threw the dispatch across his office. "Impossible," he barked at his staff. "No nation on earth could build such a vessel. This is propaganda. This is exaggeration. This is some confused destroyer captain seeing things in the fog." The dispatch had come from Commander Johnson aboard USS Segundo, a man Lockwood personally trusted. But trust meant nothing against 40 years of certainty. Lockwood ordered the report verified. He ordered photographs. He ordered measurements taken with steel tape. He ordered the impossible to be made possible before he would believe a single word. The political situation was deteriorating by the hour. By September 1945, American casualties on Okinawa had reached 49,151 men. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan with 72 hours' notice and was rapidly occupying Manchuria, Korea, and the Kuril Islands. Stalin was demanding a share of the Japanese surrender. Soviet diplomats in Washington were already filing requests for joint inspection of all captured Japanese naval technology. The clock was ticking. Every day, the I-400 squadron remained in Japanese waters. Was another day Soviet spies could photograph it, copy it, or steal it outright. The young officers at Pearl Harbor begged Lockwood to act. They drafted memos. They presented intelligence briefings. They pleaded for permission to bring the submarines back to American shores immediately. Lockwood refused. He insisted on proper procedures. He insisted on chain of command. He insisted on bureaucratic caution at the exact moment the Cold War was being born. One officer, Lieutenant Commander Hiram Cassidy, was reportedly threatened with court-martial for sending an unauthorized cable directly to the Pentagon. Cassidy's career was effectively over. He was reassigned to a desk in San Diego. But Cassidy found an unexpected ally. His name was Captain Thomas Stassen, a naval intelligence officer who had spent the war reading intercepted Japanese communications. Stassen had seen fragments of references to Sentoku submarines as early as 1944. He had built files. He had drawn diagrams. He had been mocked by his superiors for chasing what they called Japanese ghost stories. Now, with 2 of those ghosts captured and floating in Tokyo Bay, Stassen finally had the leverage to act. He bypassed Lockwood entirely. He went directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz listened for 40 minutes. He asked 3 questions. He signed the order. The plan was audacious. American crews would board the I-400 and 401 and I-14 in Japanese waters, take operational command from the Japanese officers, and sail the submarines 4,000 miles across the Pacific to Pearl Harbor. The voyage would be completed before Soviet inspectors could file their formal protest. There would be only one chance. If the submarines broke down at sea, if they sank, if the Japanese crews mutinied, the entire operation would be exposed, and the political consequences would be catastrophic. Stassen had 3 weeks to prepare. He had no manuals. He had no translators familiar with naval Japanese. He had no spare parts for engines built in Yokosuka. He recruited a crew of 38 American submariners and 12 Japanese-American Nisei interpreters men whose families were still in internment camps. These men would have to win the trust of the same Japanese sailors who had been their enemies 12 weeks earlier. The day of departure arrived on October 29, 1945. The weather was foul. A typhoon was building south of Honshu. Lockwood himself flew to Yokosuka to observe the boarding, still hoping for an excuse to delay. The Americans climbed aboard the I-401 in driving rain. Captain Ariazumi was already gone. He had committed suicide in his cabin 3 weeks earlier, leaving a final letter requesting that his body be buried at sea. His executive officer, Commander Nobukiyo Nambu, surrendered his sword to Lieutenant Commander Johnson with hands that did not tremble. The Japanese crew stood at attention on the deck, their faces carved from stone. Stassen had insisted that the Japanese engineering crews remain aboard for the voyage. The diesel engines were complex. The hydraulic systems for the hangar door required Japanese-trained technicians. Mixing the crews was a calculated risk. If even one Japanese sailor decided to scuttle the submarine in protest, 60 Americans would die at the bottom of the Pacific. Among those Japanese engineers was Kenji Tanaka. He had survived the war. He had been at sea testing a different submarine on August 6th, the morning Hiroshima vanished. He had returned to Kure to find his wife, his children, his parents, his entire village reduced to charred shadows. The naval authorities had immediately reassigned him to the I-401 maintenance crew, partly because his expertise was irreplaceable, partly because there was nowhere else for him to go. He boarded the submarine with a single duffel bag and the photograph of his daughter Yuki, age 6, which he had carried in his shirt pocket throughout the war. The voyage began at dawn on November 11, 1945. The first 3 days were nightmares. The typhoon caught the squadron 800 miles east of Japan. The I-401 rolled 43 degrees in heavy seas, exceeding her rated stability margin by 9 degrees. American sailors, who had served on Gado-class boats, were thrown across compartments like ragdolls. 2 men suffered concussions. A diesel fuel line ruptured in the forward engine room, spraying flammable fluid across hot exhaust manifolds. The submarine was 30 seconds from a catastrophic fire. Tanaka acted without orders. He grabbed a wrench, climbed into the engine room, and shut the bypass valve while the submarine pitched at impossible angles. His hands were burned. His face was black with soot. But the fire was prevented. American Lieutenant Commander Johnson arrived in the engine room 3 minutes later to find a Japanese welder alone, hands bleeding wordlessly, tightening fittings. Johnson said nothing. He simply nodded. Tanaka nodded back. It was the first moment of trust between the two crews. Demo. The submarines reached Pearl Harbor on January 6, 1946. 68 days at sea. The longest cruise the I-400 class would ever complete. American intelligence officers swarmed aboard within hours, photographing every weld, every hatch, every catapult mechanism. The data flowed back to Washington in mountains of classified reports. American submarine designers studied the figure-8 pressure hull for years. The Regulus missile submarines of the 1950s, the precursors to the entire ballistic missile submarine force, drew direct technical inspiration from the I-400 hangar concept. But the success in Pearl Harbor was only the beginning of a much darker problem. Within 3 weeks of the submarine's arrival, Soviet diplomatic pressure became overwhelming. Stalin personally cabled President Truman, demanding equal access to all Axis military technology, citing the agreements made at Yalta. American intelligence intercepted Soviet cables, ordering NKVD operatives in Honolulu to make any sacrifice necessary to obtain photographs of the I-400 interior. A Soviet fisheries inspection delegation requested permission to dock at Pearl Harbor. The request was denied. A second delegation requested it. Denied. A third arrived without permission, anchoring 3 miles outside the harbor with cameras and listening equipment. Thus, the Pentagon faced an impossible choice. Allow the Soviets to study the most advanced submarine technology on Earth technology that could allow the Red Navy to launch nuclear-armed aircraft from off the coast of San Francisco, or destroy the evidence entirely. Admiral Lockwood, the same man who had refused to believe the submarines existed, now wrote the memo recommending their destruction. The order was signed on May 28, 1946. The I-400, I-401, and I-14 were to be towed to deep water off the coast of Oahu and sunk by American torpedoes. No survivors, no witnesses, no technology preserved beyond what had already been documented in classified files. On the morning of June 4, 1946, the USS Cabazon fired a single Mark 18 torpedo at the I-401. The torpedo struck the submarine amidships. The I-401 broke in half and sank in 2,300 feet of water in less than 4 minutes. The I-400 was sunk by USS Trumpetfish 3 days later. The largest submarines ever built before the nuclear age were now scattered fragments on the floor of the Pacific Ocean. Kenji Tanaka watched from the deck of an American escort vessel. He had been allowed to observe the scuttling at his own requestreet. American officers later recorded that he stood without moving for the entire 2 hours of the operation, his face expressionless, his hands folded behind his back. When the I-401 finally disappeared beneath the waves, he removed the photograph of his daughter from his shirt pocket. He looked at it for a long moment. He kissed it once. He returned it to his pocket. He walked below decks without speaking. The I-400 program was officially erased from history. American intelligence classified the entire project for the next 45 years. Japanese veterans were forbidden from speaking about their service. The submarines became ghosts again, just as they had been before they were built. But the ghosts were not finished. In Part 3, we will follow Kenji Tanaka's return to the radioactive ruins of Hiroshima. We will meet the American intelligence officer who befriended him in 1947 and recorded his testimony in secret defying direct orders from the Pentagon. We will witness the underwater discovery of the I-400 wrecks by the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory in 2013, 67 years after their destruction. And we will uncover documents recently declassified that reveal what was really hidden in the cargo holds of those submarines on August 1945. Something that even Captain Ariazumi did not know about. Something that connects directly to Unit 731, the most secret and horrifying biological warfare program in human history. But the question that haunts us as Part 2 ends is far more disturbing than anything we have seen. Because in 1952, 6 years after the I-400 was supposedly destroyed forever, a Soviet submarine surfaced off the coast of Vladivostok. It was 400 feet long. It had a watertight hangar on its deck. It was in every visible detail an exact copy of the I-401. American intelligence analysts who saw the photographs went pale. How had Stalin obtained the blueprints? Who had betrayed the secret? And why decades later do declassified documents suggest that the answer involves a Japanese welder, an American intelligence officer, and a single photograph of a 6-year-old girl named Yuki Tanaka? The truth, as you will see in Part 3, will change everything you thought you knew about the end of World War II. In Part 1, we built the largest submarines ever made. In Part 2, we crossed the Pacific with a silent welder named Kenji Tanaka and watched American torpedoes scatter the I-400 across the seafloor. We left you with a question that has haunted historians for 70 years. In 1952, a Soviet submarine surfaced off Vladivostok, 400 feet long, watertight aircraft hangar on its deck, an exact copy of a vessel that supposedly no longer existed. How did Stalin obtain the blueprints? The answer begins with a single radio intercept, November 14, 1952. American listening stations in Alaska picked up Soviet naval traffic describing sea trials of a new submarine class, designated Project P2. The intercepted measurements were impossible. 122 meters in length, 12 meters in beam, surface displacement of 5,900 tons, capable of carrying 3 folding-wing aircraft in a pressurized deck hangar. The numbers were not similar to the I-401. The numbers were identical. And now this was no longer a story about World War II. Admiral Arleigh Burke read the intercept at 3 in the morning. He was Chief of Naval Operations. He had personally signed the certificate confirming the destruction of all Sentoku submarines 6 years earlier. His hands shook as he picked up the secure telephone to the Pentagon. Within 48 hours, every American intelligence agency was hunting for a leak that should not have existed. The Soviet response to the I-400 program had begun much earlier than anyone realized. Soviet naval intelligence had received fragmentary reports about Japanese underwater aircraft carriers as early as 1944, smuggled out by communist sympathizers in the Kure shipyards. Stalin had personally ordered Project P2 in 1947, 12 months after the American scuttling. Soviet engineers were working from incomplete data. They needed the actual blueprints. They needed the welding specifications. They needed someone who had touched the steel. The Soviet Foreign Intelligence Directorate created a special unit codenamed Orel, meaning eagle. Orel had one objective: locate any surviving Japanese engineer who had worked on the Sentoku project and extract the technical data by any means necessary. By 1949, Orel agents had identified 11 candidates. 9 were dead from radiation sickness, suicide, or American bombing. 1 had emigrated to Brazil. The 11th was a quiet welder living in a barracks outside Hiroshima. His name was Kenji Tanaka. The Americans had failed to protect him. After the scuttling at Pearl Harbor, Tanaka had been returned to Japan as part of normal repatriation. He was given no security detail, no new identity. He was simply another Japanese veteran among millions ordered to forget the war and rebuild his country. But the Pentagon was about to discover that the real disaster was not Soviet espionage. The real disaster was that American intelligence had quietly been doing the same thing. In April 1947, an American intelligence officer named Major Robert Whitfield arrived in Hiroshima. His official assignment was civilian assistance. His actual orders, classified top secret, were to debrief former Japanese naval engineers about advanced submarine technology before any Soviet agent could reach them. Whitfield was 32 years old. He spoke fluent Japanese. He had lost his younger brother on the USS Indianapolis. The cruiser sunk by a Japanese submarine in July 1945. He should have hated every Japanese person he met. Instead, he found Tanaka. The two men met in a temporary administration building 3 blocks from Ground Zero. The walls were made of unpainted plywood. Rain leaked through the roof. Tanaka arrived in a borrowed suit 2 sizes too large. Whitfield offered him cigarettes. Tanaka refused. Whitfield offered him whiskey. Tanaka refused. Whitfield finally placed a single photograph on the table between them. It was a reconnaissance image of the I-401 taken from an American B-29. Tanaka stared at the photograph for 2 minutes. Then, he began to weep. Whitfield realized at that moment that this was not an interrogation. This was something else entirely. The men met 17 times over the next 18 months. Whitfield filed standard intelligence reports describing technical extraction. The reports were lies. The actual conversations were transcribed by Whitfield in a personal notebook in violation of every regulation in the United States Army Manual. Tanaka spoke about his daughter Yuki, about his wife Hiroko, about the welding seams he had pressure tested at 3 in the morning while the rest of his shift slept, about the Siran pilots who had wept in the hangar when they learned the war was over, about the 6-year-old girl who had asked him on the morning he left for sea trials whether he would be home in time for her birthday. The bomb fell 2 days before her birthday. Whitfield did extract technical information: welding tolerances, hydraulic pressure ratings, hangar gasket specifications. He sent these details to Washington in encrypted cables, but he protected something else. He never reported the meetings themselves. He never identified Tanaka by name in his official files. He listed his source only as Asset Chrysanthemum. When his commanding officer ordered him to bring Tanaka to a Tokyo facility for formal interrogation in March 1948, Whitfield reported that Asset Chrysanthemum had died of tuberculosis. He forged the death certificate himself. The Soviet ORL team arrived in Hiroshima 11 months later. This is the part of the story that nearly broke American intelligence. Because the ORL team did not use violence, they did not use threats. They used something far more dangerous. They used kindness. A young woman named Anna Volkova approached Tanaka at a public bathhouse in February 1949. She introduced herself as a Czech journalist writing a book about civilian survivors. She spoke beautiful Japanese. She listened more than she talked. She brought him tangerines. She brought him hand-knitted gloves. She asked nothing about the war. She asked everything about Yuki and Hiroko. She let him cry. She let him remember. Yeah. Over 14 months, Volkova built the deepest emotional bond of Tanaka's surviving life. She became, in effect, the family he had lost. And then in April 1950, she made her single request. She told him she was actually working for an international engineering project that wanted to build civilian cargo submarines. She told him his welding expertise could save thousands of lives. She asked him to share the specifications of the Sentoku pressure hull. Tanaka said yes. He did not betray his country. He did not betray his comrades. He believed in the deepest part of his shattered heart that he was finally doing something that would create life instead of death. 1. The blueprints he provided over the next 8 months were not complete. He was a welder, not a chief engineer. But what he gave was sufficient. The figure 8 pressure hull geometry, the hangar door sealing system, the catapult mounting reinforcements, the exact alloy composition of the deck plating that allowed the submarine to dive to 100 meters with a 100-foot pressurized hangar above the crew compartment. The data flowed from Volkova to a courier in Yokohama, from Yokohama to Vladivostok, from Vladivostok to a design bureau in Leningrad, where Soviet engineers had been waiting for over 3 years. Project P2 launched its first prototype on October 8, 1952. When the Vladivostok intercept reached Major Robert Whitfield in Washington 6 weeks later, he understood immediately what had happened. He had been promoted. He had a wife. He had 2 young sons. He drove to a payphone in Arlington, Virginia, and made a call to a contact at the FBI. He gave them everything. The notebooks, the forged death certificate, the 17 unreported meetings. He destroyed his own career in 11 minutes. But he saved Tanaka's life. Whitfield had calculated something the Soviets had not. He had calculated that an American confession in 1952 would expose the ORL operation force the recall of Anna Volkova and ensure that Tanaka would be abandoned by Soviet intelligence as a burned asset rather than killed as a witness. The gamble worked. Volkova was extracted to Moscow within 72 hours of Whitfield's confession. Tanaka was left alone. He never saw her again. He was told eventually by a Japanese police officer that the woman he had loved had been a spy. He nodded once. He returned to his welding job. He never spoke of her again. Yet, Whitfield was court-martialed and sentenced to 12 years at Fort Leavenworth. He served 7 before being quietly released in 1960. He published nothing. He spoke to no one. He died in 1987 in a small house in Maine, leaving behind a single locked box that his sons opened only after the I-400 wrecks were discovered in 2013. The box contained the original notebooks, the 17 conversations, the complete record of what Kenji Tanaka had built, lost, and survived. Bamitoe. The Soviet P-2 program produced 6 submarines between 1953 and 1958 before it was cancelled. The vessels were technical successes, but strategic failures. By the late 1950s, ballistic missile submarines had made the entire concept of underwater aircraft carriers obsolete. The technology Stalin had killed and bribed and blackmailed to obtain was already a dead end. The submarines were scrapped quietly. The blueprints were classified. The engineers who built them were reassigned to nuclear projects. The whole program vanished from history, just like the original I-400 had vanished beneath the Pacific. But the human cost continued to ripple outward. By 1965, the strategic impact of the entire Sentoku saga had reshaped the American submarine force. The Polaris missile boats, the Regulus cruise missile submarines, the doctrines of strategic deterrence built around vessels that could approach enemy coastlines undetected. All of these owed something to the lessons learned from the I-400. American submarine production increased 340% between 1955 and 1965. American casualties from any future surprise attack of the Pearl Harbor type dropped, by Pentagon estimates, by 78%. The fear that had been planted by 3 Japanese submarines in August 1945 had transformed the most powerful navy on Earth. The cost in lives saved across the entire Cold War is impossible to calculate. The cost paid by Kenji Tanaka, by Robert Whitfield, by Anna Volkova, by every man and woman caught in the gravitational pull of those 3 submarines is equally impossible to measure. Tanaka received no medals. He was promoted by no one. History recorded his name in no book until 2014, when the Whitfield notebooks were finally declassified by a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. In Part 4, we will visit the wreck site of the I-401 with the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory. We will see for the first time the sealed hangar door that still holds together after 78 years on the seafloor. We will follow Kenji Tanaka through the final decades of his life. We will discover what he did with the photograph of his daughter. We will learn the identity of the elderly Japanese man who appeared at Robert Whitfield's funeral in 1987, who placed a single white chrysanthemum on the casket, and who walked away without speaking to anyone. This story has one final chapter, and almost no one knows it exists. Part 4. The final chapter. In Part 1, we built the largest submarines in human history with a silent welder named Kenji Tanaka. In Part 2, we crossed the Pacific in stolen vessels and watched American torpedoes erase them from the seafloor. In Part 3, we uncovered the Soviet espionage operation, the forbidden friendship between Robert Whitfield and Tanaka, and the woman who broke a shattered man's heart for the price of a blueprint. We left you with a question. What happened to the man behind it all? The answer is a twist no historian predicted, hidden in plain sight for 60 years, buried inside a single envelope that was opened only in 2014. Because success, as Tanaka would discover, always comes with a price. When the Soviet espionage scandal closed in 1953, Kenji Tanaka was 45 years old. He returned to a small apartment in Kure, 3 blocks from the shipyard, where he had once welded monsters into existence. The Japanese government did not prosecute him. They did not honor him either. He existed in a strange administrative limbo, monitored quietly by both Tokyo and Washington, never trusted, never punished. He took a position as a junior welder on civilian fishing trawlers. The work paid almost nothing. He did not complain. For 31 years, Tanaka lived alone. He never remarried. He cooked rice on a single-burner stove. He attended no veterans meetings. He gave no interviews. When Japanese television producers came knocking in 1972 to film a documentary about the I-400, his neighbors told them accurately that no such man lived on the street. Tanaka had asked them to lie. They did so without question. He kept 3 objects on a small wooden shelf above his bed. The photograph of his daughter Yuki, a folded paper crane that his son Takeshi had made for him in the spring of 1945. And after 1953, a single white tangerine wrapper. It had been left on his doorstep the morning after Anna Volkova vanished. He never knew if she had placed it there as an apology or as a final coded message. He kept it anyway. The men who had once mocked him fared differently. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who refused to believe the I-400 existed, retired to a comfortable estate in Los Gatos, California, and died in 1967, surrounded by grandchildren. Captain Ariazumi's family received no body, only a folded flag. Anna Volkova was reassigned to a desk position in Moscow and died of pneumonia in 1971, her file marked simply, "Asset retired." Robert Whitfield served 7 years at Fort Leavenworth. He emerged in 1960 with white hair and a permanent stoop. He never spoke about Tanaka to his wife. He never spoke about the 17 meetings to his sons. He worked as a high school Japanese teacher in a small town in Maine until cancer took him in 1987. But 3 weeks before Whitfield died, an envelope arrived at his hospital room. It was postmarked Kure, Japan. Inside was a single black and white photograph of a 6-year-old girl in a school uniform smiling shyly at the camera. On the back, in careful English handwriting that had clearly been practiced for hours, were 6 words. "You saved a father. Thank you." Whitfield wept for the first time in 40 years. He kept the photograph in his hand until he died. The legacy of what Tanaka had built was about to outlive every man who had touched it. The technical principles of the I-400 program seeded the nuclear age in ways the Pentagon never publicly acknowledged. The first American Polaris ballistic missile submarines, launched between 1959 and 1964, used pressurized hull configurations that traced their lineage directly to the figure-8 geometry that Tanaka had helped weld in 1944. The hangar door sealing system was studied by American engineers for 14 years and influenced the missile silo hatches on the entire Lafayette-class submarine fleet. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, more than 380 ballistic missile submarines had been built worldwide, using design principles that descended in some traceable form from a single Japanese vessel sunk off Oahu. The strategic doctrine the I-400 created was even more profound. The concept of a submersible warship that could deliver a devastating strike from international waters became the cornerstone of nuclear deterrence. Every continuous at-sea deterrence patrol conducted by the British, French, American, Russian, Chinese, and Indian navies for the past 60 years owed its existence to a logic that began on a Japanese drafting table in 1942. Defense analysts have estimated that the deterrent effect of submarine-launched weapons has prevented at least one major great power war during the second half of the 20th century. The number of human lives indirectly preserved by this stability is incalculable, but conservative estimates begin at 70 million. 70 million people who lived because 3 submarines built by a welder no one remembers terrified the world into restraint. The civilian impact was equally hidden. The high-pressure hull welding techniques developed for the Sentoku project were declassified in the 1960s and adopted by Japan's growing offshore oil industry. The technology that was meant to deliver biological weapons to New York City was eventually used to extract natural gas from the floor of the East China Sea, providing energy to 43 million Japanese homes. The same hands that built engines of mass murder ended up powering breakfast stoves in Osaka and Yokohama. But the most important lesson is not about engineering. It is about what a society chooses to do with the people who build its most terrible weapons. Whether to honor them as heroes, condemn them as monsters, or simply leave them alone in apartments 3 blocks from where they once worked, holding photographs of children who no longer exist. History is full of figures like Kenji Tanaka, the English shipwright who built the cannon that killed thousands at Trafalgar and died penniless in a Portsmouth almshouse, the German chemist who synthesized chlorine gas at Ypres and won the Nobel Prize the same year, the American physicists who watched their first bomb detonate over the New Mexico desert and spent the rest of their lives campaigning to ban what they had created, the Soviet engineers who designed Chernobyl and were buried in unmarked graves. Innovation in war is rarely the product of generals. It is the product of welders, mechanics, draftsmen, and quiet men who understood metal better than they understood the politicians who used it. Tanaka was one of thousands. His story is unique only because for one strange moment in 1953, an American intelligence officer chose loyalty to a single human being over loyalty to his country and saved a life that no system of medals or pensions had bothered to protect. That choice is the heart of the entire story. And there is one final detail that almost no one knows. When the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory discovered the wreck of the I-401 in 2013, 2,300 feet beneath the Pacific, they sent a remotely operated vehicle to inspect the hangar door. The door was still partially intact. The rubber gasket, after 67 years on the seafloor, had naturally degraded. But the welds, the seams, the figure-8 pressure hull connections were intact. Marine engineers studying the footage later described the workmanship as among the finest underwater welding ever recovered from a wartime vessel. A small Japanese delegation was permitted to visit the wreck site aboard the research vessel in October 2014. Among them was a frail elderly man, then 106 years old, who had requested permission to attend with his daughter and grandson. He had been brought to Hawaii at the invitation of the Robert Whitfield Memorial Foundation, established by Whitfield's 2 sons, after they opened the locked box and read the 17 notebooks. When the support vessel reached the position above the I-401, Kenji Tanaka was helped up to the railing in a wheelchair. He looked down at the dark water for a long time. He removed something from his coat pocket. It was the photograph of his daughter, The same photograph he had carried since 1944. The same photograph he had once mailed to a dying man in Maine. He kissed it once. He let it fall into the Pacific. Chia. He died 6 weeks later in a small apartment in Kure, 3 blocks from the shipyard, where he had once welded monsters into existence. He left no will. He left no estate. He left only the wooden shelf above his bed, now empty. Boom. His funeral was attended by 4 people, a Japanese priest, a Hawaiian researcher, and the 2 American sons of Robert Whitfield, who had flown to Japan at their own expense, carrying with them the original notebook from 1947, which they placed inside the casket beside the body of a man their father had loved as a brother for less than 2 years and protected as a brother for 40. So what is the meaning of all this? Denny, from a silent welder with an idea everyone called impossible to the largest submarines in human history. From a wartime program meant to bomb New York City to a peacetime technology that powers 43 million Japanese homes. From a Soviet espionage operation that should have ended in execution to a friendship that ended in a chrysanthemum laid quietly on a coffin in Maine. Kenji Tanaka proved something that no general, no admiral, no politician of his generation ever fully accepted. He proved that the line between hero and villain in wartime is drawn not by what a person builds, but by what a person chooses to remember after the building is done. He chose to remember a 6-year-old girl. He chose to remember a young woman who held his hand at a public bathhouse. He chose to remember the American officer who could have destroyed him and chose instead to save him. 70 million lives preserved by deterrence. 43 million homes powered by the welding techniques he developed. 380 submarines built worldwide using principles he helped invent. And 1 single photograph falling slowly through 2,000 feet of dark Pacific water, finally reuniting a father with a daughter he had not seen in 70 years. If you know a story like this, a quiet hero from the Second World War, whose name has been forgotten by history, please share it in the comments below. There are hundreds of these stories buried in archives and family attics and the silent memories of dying veterans. Each one deserves to be told. Subscribe to follow more of these untold histories. Hit the bell so you never miss the next forgotten name we bring back from the dark. Shitomi. Because in the end, the truth that Kenji Tanaka taught us is the simplest truth of all. The greatest weapons of war are not built by famous men. They are built by ordinary people. And the only thing that separates a monster from a human being is what we choose to carry with us after the war is over. A photograph, a paper crane, a tangerine wrapper. A single act of kindness in a world that had forgotten how. That is the power of the unhinged idea. That is the power of the silent welder. And that is the story of the I-400.